Well, we welcome you all here this evening. My name is David Rhyme. I'm the pastor of St. Paul Lutheran Church. And we're here to discuss a very important question, that is there really a God? That's a very hotly debated question, isn't it? And you have two sides. On the one hand, you have the humanists and the evolutionists who claim that there is no God. For example, the philosopher Nietzsche taught that God is an illusion of the mind. And on the other hand, there are Christians and other religions who very emphatically state that, yes, there is a God. So how can we know for sure? That's the question that we want to consider tonight. But before we get to that question, we need to understand a few things about the two claims. On the one hand, you have men like Stephen Hawking. He is Britain's premier scientist, a physicist. He's made some very outstanding statements in the past few years, very public statements. For example, modern physics leaves no place for God in the creation of the universe. That's a pretty powerful statement. Professor Hawking sets out to answer this question: did the universe need a creator? The answer he gives is a resounding no. Professor Hawking also says a new series of theories have rendered redundant the role of a creator for the universe. And then he also says because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. And finally, he also says it is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. Now that's his belief, isn't it? And there are many people who share that belief. But we need to understand one thing, that is all it is their belief. Evolution is nothing more than an alternate belief that makes it possible for people that don't want to believe there is a God. Just because someone believes that this world created itself and came about by itself doesn't necessarily mean that that's how it happened. On the other hand, we have those who believe in creation. They believe the Bible, which says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It's the very first passage of the Bible. And of course, the same thing is true of Christians. Just because they believe that there is a God who created the universe doesn't necessarily mean that that's true, or that there is a God. So, who is right? One more thing that we need to understand before we get into the question of how we can know for sure is to realize that this is not a debate between science versus the Bible. It's a debate between two opposing belief systems, and science cannot prove either evolution or creation. Let me explain why. All true science is based on what we call the scientific method. And that begins with observation. If you want to find out how something works, you've got to observe it, study it, watch it. And that, of course, brings up the first problem when it comes to this debate about the origins of the world and the origins of life, is it's impossible to observe. None of us were there to see it happen. There was no man there. And therefore, it's impossible to study something scientifically if you can't observe it. Well, the next step is to make a hypothesis. That, I guess we can do, can't we? We can guess about why we think something happens or how it happens. That's what evolution is. It's a guess about how this world came to be. But if we can't observe it, there's no way that we can prove our guess one way or another. It remains just that, a speculation, a hypothesis. The next step in the scientific method is to test your hypothesis. You have to design some kind of experiment or test to see if what you think happened is really the explanation of why things do happen. But again, if you can't observe the origins of life and the origins of the universe, there's no way that you can test it. And therefore, we also cannot do the last stage, which is to analyze the tests. Analyze the information that you've gained from those tests to see if your hypothesis was correct or not. So there's no way that any scientific experiment or proof can be done to prove either the existence of God or the non-existence of God. And finally, we also need to understand that evolution did not come about by scientific discovery. There was no discovery in any area of science that led someone to finally come to the conclusion, wait a minute, here, this disproves everything. This shows that the world evolved by itself. There's nothing like that. The whole theory of evolution came about because of the belief that there is no God. And so an atheist must, by definition, believe in evolution. That is, in a world that made itself. Because if you don't believe that God created the world, then you have to believe that it happened by itself, that it came about by some other means, natural means. Unfortunately, many people have been deceived into thinking that science has proved evolution, and so they associate evolution with science. No scientist can claim that they have proved that the world evolved by itself, and no Christian can say that we have some scientific proof that there is a God that created the world. Both are a belief. And so you can understand why there's also many agnostics in the world. People who say, I don't know if there's a God or not. And they also say, there's no way that we can tell. There's no way we can find out for sure. But that's not necessarily the only other conclusion that we can come to. What we can do is look at the evidence around us. And that includes the proven laws of science that are universally accepted, and then compare the two claims. That's what we're going to do tonight. I've selected just 4 simple, universally accepted laws of science. I'm going to briefly explain what they are and what they state, and then let you weigh the evidence. You decide for yourself which of these 2 claims really fits the scientific evidence that we have, and which of them makes more sense. All right, so the first universally accepted law of science that we want to talk about tonight is that there is no spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation means that living things were able to simply generate themselves out of non-living things spontaneously. For example, it was once believed that maggots spontaneously came to life out of the rotten meat. People saw, a piece of rotten meat, there usually was maggots on it, so they came to the conclusion that the maggots just came from the meat itself. Well, of course, you all know now that Louis Pasteur used scientific methods to study and examine that, and proved that the maggots did not generate from rotten meat, but came from fly eggs laid on the meat. And he was the one who first discovered the fact that maggots are simply the larva stage of a fly. And so now it's universally accepted that living things only come from other living things. I'm sure you all know that. No credible scientist will deny that truth. Living things cannot simply generate out of non-living things. All right, now you weigh the evidence against the two claims. The theory of evolution requires that sometime in the distant past, living organisms did arise out of non-living substances. Even though it's never been observed anywhere, even though we've proven that that doesn't happen, still evolutionists believe that that did happen sometime in the past, because after all, here we are. There's a very interesting article in a recent Maclean's magazine. This article is about the discovery of new planets, extrasolar planets out in the universe. They're trying desperately to find these other planets. They would like to find some planet that is similar to the Earth, that they think possibly life could have evolved there as well. And so they're searching for these planets in hopes that they can find other life out in the universe. But the point that I thought was very interesting is this statement right here. It might seem myopic, I think that's short-sighted, right? Nearsighted? Yeah. To hunt for other forms of life by seeking out planets that look exactly like our own. After all, we still don't understand how life sprung up here on Earth. At least they're honest. You can see these scientists don't understand how life could have sprung up by itself, because it's never been observed to happen, and yet they believe that it did happen. So you can see the whole theory is based on their belief, not on any evidence in the world. A more scientific explanation would be to say that because we've never observed anything like this ever happening, therefore any theory, any hypothesis that we come up with that suggests that it did happen, we should throw out as not being a scientific solution. The Bible account of creation, of course, says that all living things did come from other living things. And in the beginning, all living things came from a very wise and powerful living being. That belief agrees perfectly with the evidence we have in the world around us. So the second universally accepted law of science is called the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics states that everything in the universe is experiencing energy loss or heat death. It is running down like a wound-up clock. This is also known as the law of increasing entropy. Simply stated, the second law of thermodynamics says that everything in the universe is going from a state of order to disorder unless it's acted upon by an outside force. We see examples of this second law of thermodynamics in our daily lives all the time. For example, our cars. Our cars don't go from this to this by themselves, do they? I wish they would. They go the other way around. Things start to break down, go wrong, it starts to rust until eventually it looks like this. And it'll continue to get worse as time goes on unless it's acted upon by an outside force, right? If somebody comes along and takes that car and puts in hundreds of hours of work and energy and new parts and a lot of cost and expense, then you can restore that to look like this again. But it's not going to happen by itself. It's not going to happen by natural processes. Here we see that same law of thermodynamics in nature. Things grow old, they die, they decay. These once majestic trees died and become rotting stumps. Now you can weigh the evidence. Evolutionists claim that this world is increasing in order and complexity, and that all living things are getting better and becoming more and more complex all the time. Whereas the creation account of the Bible says that God created everything perfect in the beginning, And He created all living organisms to reproduce according to their kind, so that there is a renewing of life on the earth.